My name is Camille Brown. I'm one of the graduate students in the Spanish and Portuguese department, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. Briefly, I want to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Engdahl. He's a clinical investigator at the Brain Sciences Center in the Minneapolis Veterans Affairs Healthcare Center, and he holds the William L. Anderson Chair in PTSD Research, and he's an adjunct professor in neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science at the U of M. He's been a leading researcher in PTSD since the 1980s, and he has a particular emphasis on prisoners of war. He's been treating veterans since 1979. His frequent presentations and media appearances are aimed at raising society's awareness of what PTSD is. And his collaborations focus on Holocaust offspring, torture victims, immigrants, and the role of spirituality in recovery and traumatization. He combines a clinician's perspective with scholarly investigation into trauma and its multi-generational transmission.
A couple of prepared remarks and then on to some visuals. In the words of Charles Figley, the longer we study trauma, the field of traumatology, the more it seems to incorporate the essence of human experience. Both the adversity and the growth, the horror and the beauty, traumatology is exploding in its scope. It was originally a narrow specialty within medicine, emergency medicine, and then the field extended to include psychological injury, mental health, and more recently the fields of law, history, and broadly, as is shown here today and tomorrow, the humanities, the arts. This is why we are here today. Social historical examination allows us new ways to view the long-term effects and meanings of major traumas. And these traumas are experienced by individuals, whole communities, nations, and peoples. These traumas are natural, Pompeii, Hurricane Katrina, and of human origin, the Holocaust, and much of what you will hear about here in these next few days. The expansion of traumatology is driven in part by scientific breakthroughs, and I hope to give you a quick overview of those here in the next few minutes. This includes our ability to discern, to see the neurobiological basis of trauma and the trauma responses. I do start off with a look at our genes, and then our lifetime experiences, epigenetics, and the outward expression, their final manifestations in the ways that we think, feel, and behave. The process in mapping the basis of behavior, these levels of analyses, if you will, that process has implications for all fields involving human thought and response, right from genes up to the broadest level of analyses, such as you will hear about. This conference can contribute to broader understanding of immediate and long-term consequences, both good and bad, the consequences of trauma for individuals and for communities and nations. Where did we start? The oldest written records are inscribed on tablets. 2000 BC, the Sumerian king Ur-Namma was killed. His army was destroyed. The city of Ur and the people were devastated. They began to inscribe descriptions of nightmares, difficulty sleeping, a great deal of hypervigilance, worries that the calamity would descend again. And it was probably the earliest written illustration of attribution of symptoms to causes, the battle, the deaths, the devastation, a direct link between trauma and trauma response. They did not take the view that their symptoms were vengeance of the gods or something that just happened and came from the spirit world. And of course, looking at literature, we certainly have vivid illustrations of trauma and trauma response, easily shown in the works of Homer, Shakespeare. I'm showing you an illustration, a painting of Napoleon's retreat from Russia in 2012. The Russians, the Germans, the French began to describe something they saw in their soldiers as nostalgia. These soldiers were tremulous. These soldiers were not combat effective. They wanted to go home, and so you would see that term used there in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries early on. In our own American Civil War, there were tens of thousands of soldiers observed to be tremulous, have high heart rates. They had chest pains. If they made the slightest effort, they would become exhausted. They had a nervous exhaustion. The physician who wrote about it was Da Costa, so there was a Da Costa syndrome. Soldier's heart was also a term applied to this. In the late 19th century, there was an explosive expansion of railway development in Britain. And the work was not always safe or of high quality. What we're seeing here is an image of an engine run off a bridge. One can trace the last 5 years of Charles Dickens' life as clearly illustrating what we now would call post-traumatic stress disorder. He was on a train with his mistress and her mother, and they came up at high speed to a bridge that was lacking a rail. The entire train derailed. 10 people were killed, 50 were injured. After Charles Dickens made sure his mistress and her mother were safe, he clambered out, climbed down, tried to tend to the wounded, saw people die. And from that point on, even though he rescued a manuscript and finished that, he produced nothing of value. Those who were around him saw that he was tremulous. He described it. He showed it in his handwriting. He could never ride in any comfortable sense on transit again. So he became very almost housebound, but clear evidence of a stress disorder syndrome in a famous figure. Of course, we have not only the industrial dark side leading to trauma, injury, and so forth, we have industrialized, mechanized warfare, the trench warfare of World War I, producing a great deal of PTSD, a great deal of literature also. I was just reading some poetry by Siegfried Sassoon, coming directly from his heart and his experiences in World War I. There have been so many different terms used over the years. I apologize for the busyness of this next slide, but here we have the historical names for PTSD. Shell shock was big in World War I. The early attempts to explain the occurrence were giving attribution to the concussive effects of the high explosives that were used in trench warfare. Jumping back to the late 1800s, Charles Dickens, there were a tremendous number of claims made by people who were in railroad accidents, who had no clear physical injury, but they were clearly devastated. So railway spine became a term applied to them in the legal context, and it was written about as such. Soldier's heart, I've already talked about. Exhaustion, delirium, effort syndrome, battle fatigue, so on and so forth. There have been all these struggles, and then I'll be presenting to you the way the American Psychiatric Association has dealt with it. There's a curious pattern that exists as we look at the literature, as we try to trace the attention that the medical world as well as the general public pay to cases of PTSD following the war. There's kind of a spike after our Civil War, after World War I, Korean War, World War II, Vietnam War. Well, the Vietnam War is an exception. But the previous spikes were followed by tapering of attention and concern about it. The problem in the minds of most people just went away. But for those who experienced trauma, it did not go away. Ken Burns recently did a vivid documentary on the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War occurred in a context of social protest where civil rights were being pursued, asserted. We're here with Humphrey and his spirit in this room, and certainly his efforts, LBJ's, so many worked very hard to pass civil rights laws and start to change things.
I'm just going to interrupt a second. I'm going to move this over.
All right.
If you can be closer to this.
Okay. All right. All right. So the climate of social activism, we're not going to take this lying down. Civil rights, the women's movement, the emergence of writings about battered women syndrome, our own College of Liberal Arts psychology professor, Pat Fraser. I knew her when she was a graduate student. She also trained at our VA Medical Center. Before getting her PhD, she hit the airwaves big time in a journal called The American Psychologist in conjunction with Eugene Borghita. Her article was titled Rape Trauma Syndrome. This was pre-PTSD. Okay, these are the mid-1970s. And what we had under the leadership of a psychiatrist from Iowa, Nancy Andreasen, and the American Psychiatric Association, was a committee established to develop a diagnostic category that would apply to post-trauma reactions. You had, I would say at times, almost competing factions. There were the Holocaust survivors and those who worked with their offspring. I'm associated with that, as I'll tell you about briefly. They wanted to have a concentration camp syndrome. The rape trauma survivors wanted their syndrome. Vietnam vets wanted Vietnam syndrome to be an official diagnosis. Nancy Andreasen had worked on a burn unit as a psychiatrist. She knew that PTSD was real. So there were all of these competing and ultimately cooperating factions that came together. Certainly the Vietnam veterans were not going to let this pass. And what I mean by this is illustrated by this listing of the American Diagnostic Manual. This determines how healthcare providers are trained, how they are reimbursed, and so forth. So in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual number 1 in 1952, there was a gross stress reaction. It could be caused by traumatic experiences adults go through. However, it was supposed to resolve within 6 months. Clearly not the case. Any such category fell off the radar for DSM-2. There was something called the adjustment reaction to adult life. It could include anything from combat to unplanned pregnancy. DSM-3 is where Nancy Andreasen and crew put forth post-traumatic stress disorder. 1980 marks the birthday, if you will, of this diagnostic category. And you could count perhaps 100 articles that were related to it in the academic journals. Now the number is in the tens of thousands, so there has really been an explosion in the last 40 years, 39 years. There have been revisions. DSM-3R went from 12 symptoms to 17 symptoms. DSM-4 shuffled them around a bit. DSM-5, the current version, which I'm not too crazy about, so to speak, added a lot of symptoms. You have a competing system, World Health Organization, Geneva, United Nations, the International Classification of Diseases, ICD, and my friend Chris Bruin and many others in Europe had their way. And now PTSD in ICD-11 is 6 symptoms. So we have an unfortunate divergence of symptoms and unfortunately in not a lot of agreement. We do miss some cases if we use that ICD set of standards. So just graphically, again, to reiterate, really spine kind of...
Stand
Pardon?
Stand
Stand the mic? Okay. Sorry. Should have a walk around. Anyway. Oh, would this walk around work by chance? No. All right. Shell shock, combat fatigue, and then PTSD. Okay? My personal opinion is that trauma and stress should not be used in the same breath, let alone in the same diagnosis. Stress is something that we all go through all the time. Stress is something that we cope with, okay? Trauma, on the other hand, overwhelms a person's ability to cope. And the central features, but you know, the committee had to get together and come up with a label. And as so many products of committees turn out, it's kind of like the committee was trying to design a horse, but they came up with a camel. So here we have post-traumatic stress as the operative term. The central features are permanent painful memories. There are some evolutionary psychiatrists, psychologists, we were among them, to suggest that perhaps never forgetting the terrible thing you went through, perhaps being on guard for the rest of your life would have adaptive value in the evolutionary sense, if you're a Darwinian. Mother Nature doesn't care if you're having nightmares or if you're extremely anxious. Mother Nature cares that you survive to have children, so a case can be made that certain features of PTSD may have been and may be adaptive. The avoidance, withdrawal, avoidance of reminders, avoidance of talking about, pulling back from people, numbing down emotionally, those are negative features. Fairly stubborn, takes a long time to return to the human race for some. There are some degrees of cultural specificity, although I think the weight of opinion worldwide is that the top 3 bullet points I put up there are pretty common across cultures. Now, different cultures, different societies will express their distress. There are different idioms of distress. It is very common for people to focus more on the physical, to have headaches, to have stomach aches, and talk about their traumatic reactions almost in a medical way. We do see a great deal of co-occurring or comorbid disorders that go along with it. In some cases, excessive use of alcohol and drugs, withdrawal from the world in general. These are attempts to self-protect and self-medicate. Oh, and lest you think that we in the business of taking care of people with PTSD are just focused on those symptoms, I always have to refer back to the words of Paul Vallant. He was one of the first psychiatrists to interview Holocaust survivors, survivors' children, and document their state, their after effects. And his words, trauma attacks the soul, are very true. Even though PTSD is this medical, social construct or contraption, if you will, there are moral dimensions. The spiritual dimension, all too often neglected in medical practice, although I mentored a woman, and there is a movement to bring it into mental health care, to clearly ask people where they are at with respect to their spiritual lives, and then work with that if it is important to them. We're trying to expand the definition of PTSD to include moral injuries, transgressions by the self, witnessing transgressions by others that perhaps you wish you had stopped. Those can be haunting and have broader effects than the list of PTSD symptoms would suggest. We can jump back to Ronnie Janoff-Buhlman, who wrote a book called Shattered Assumptions. And there's a sociological school of thought that points to how profound and pervasive trauma's impact can be if it shatters your beliefs that normally get you through your day, okay? I mean, those of us who haven't been traumatized have at some level a belief that the world is a good place, and if I'm a good person, everything will be okay. Bad things don't happen to good people, right? And then something comes along, boom, and shatters those assumptions. It becomes a real focus of therapeutic work and self-work in recovery. So, making meaning of the trauma is of central importance, and this shows up in so many ways. In the formal treatment literature, in the ways that we approach working with our patients, in the work that will be presented here today and tomorrow, you can clearly see that making meaning of trauma is essential to healing and to recovery. Okay, what predicts PTSD onset aside from your genes and the trauma itself? Just a list. Women are more likely to develop it. Previous trauma sets the stage, so does poor prior adjustment. The younger you are, the more likely you are to develop PTSD given equal levels of trauma exposure. Low education, poor poverty background. Trauma severity and agent. What I mean by that is that hurricanes, earthquakes don't tend to be real toxic in the sense of promoting the development of PTSD. If the trauma is perpetrated by another human being against you, that's very toxic, very toxic. I don't want to suggest that all the effects are negative. There is a steadily growing literature on post-traumatic growth. It's not true for everyone, but as you make meaning of your trauma, as you gain some distance, space, and recovery, my prisoners of war, who gave me, hundreds and hundreds of their hours in our research, did talk about appreciating each day after their release from captivity, the value of their life. They developed more compassion. Their priorities were reshuffled in a good way, and clearly they discovered they were stronger than they thought. So some good can come out of traumatization. I want to put in a plug for a book that I was a ghost editor on this, Intergenerational Handbook of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. That's a mouthful. Yael Dinelli, a woman who has worked tirelessly out of her Midtown Manhattan apartment to work with survivors of the Holocaust, their children and their grandchildren. We now have a foundation, we now have a website, International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. The web page address is right there. Her book is up, I put it up, the chapters are available. There'll be much more to come The International Board of Directors is just fantastic. I can't tell you how many wonderful people are affiliated with this. But I think it was about 6 years ago, I said, yeah, Al, you have this wonderful theory, and I won't take time to go through it, but it's very holistic. She talks about the individual, family, social, religious, national, international, self. Then she talks about a rupture that occurs when traumatization occurs. When you return to your life, there's often a conspiracy of silence. Certainly there was for Holocaust survivors. The homecoming may be just not a homecoming at all. You're in the present and the future. So her transgenerational, multidimensional theory was in dire need of operationalization, as we would say in mental health research. We had to put some numbers to it, okay? So she got a grant from a Rockefeller to do focus groups and diagnostic interviews with the children of Holocaust survivors. We published 4 or 5 papers that show that her approach, her theory have validity. They've been translated on this website into a myriad of languages, so they can be used with any survivor groups, certainly Portuguese, Spanish, Laotian, on and on and on. But check the website if you want to see more detail of what I am talking about. One of our database papers indicated that family history, family milieu, the parents' style had a tremendous effect on the children, and the parents, and it went beyond any sort of genetic explanation. All right, I've got 5. I can do this in 5. Okay, here we go. Where I work, Brain Sciences Center has been at the biological end of things primarily. We are at the VA Medical Center, Minneapolis, out by Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. We look at clinical disorders that affect all people, not just veterans. So PTSD, chronic multi-symptom illnesses, dementias, ALS, MS, and so on. We also have a very interesting project going on healthy aging women's brains. We have a great group of women who come back every year who are healthy at the outset, and with the passing of years, some develop dementias, and we're learning interesting things about the causes. Here we are, gathered around our glittering piece of technology. Our fearless leader is Apostolos Georgopoulos. There's me and Lisa James, who is a world expert in women and PTSD and healthy aging brains. We're working on having a total of 3 endowed chairs in neurosciences. We've got 2.5 so far. We use this rather uncommon scanner to detect brain activity in a resting state. Totally safe, no radiation, no magnetism, just sensing what your brain is doing. The clear advantage is that in a resting state, normal brains are all the same. If you can pull someone out who has a particular disorder and scan them, it's very different. You subtract the normal scan from the abnormal scan, and what is left over is the neural signature. Here we have a MEG scan of a fellow. That's a normal one. This is a fellow withdrawing from alcohol. There's a storm of cross-communication that is just uncoordinated. He's in his first day of withdrawal. Day 5, it's looking a little better. Day 7, it's looking a little better. Cross-communication patterns are settling down. And by day 15, he's getting closer to normal. Abstinence, okay? We've been able to develop clustering methods to tightly predict what disease you have from your brain scan. So this goes for MS, Sjogren's, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's. Your resting state cross-communication pattern is predictive of your diagnosis, particularly PTSD, okay? This is the one I want to dwell on. It's my next to the last slide, okay? So we have what we call a heat map. This is the front of the brain, bottom, right side. And we have a very bright spot here in the right temporal lobe, hyperconnectivity in people with active PTSD. You do see it represented in people who have recovered from their PTSD, but as they tell us, you never forget what you went through. It's a spot that corresponds to Penfield, a 1950s, 60s neurosurgeon at McGill in Montreal. He would open up people's brains, stimulate areas, and this area would trigger intense recollections of past experiences, so vivid that the people were shocked. We think it ties in with traumatic memory, uncontrolled memory. We also have a complicated theory about what drives PTSD. Genetically vulnerable people have been exposed to infections and other insults, which sets the stage for a greater likelihood of developing PTSD when trauma comes along. I invite you to go to our website. The papers are all there. If you're into that kind of thing, brain.umn.edu. We shall keep up the work. We're doing some treatment trials based on this, and I'm hoping that you all have a great 2 days. Okay?